Thanks for joining us. Okay, so let's get started, Melanie, in honor of National Poetry Month.
Yeah, very good. Let me just see if there's a way I can share your post on my Facebook. So I want to make sure. Um,
Yeah.
so,
So we are, hey, Sarah. Thanks for joining. So we are here to celebrate National Poetry Month, which was April. And so Melanie and I have been working together for the past few weeks, collaborating and putting together a poetry reading and discussion to share with you guys, and we're so excited to get to begin. So right now, Melanie's just posting a link to our Instagram on her Facebook page. So
yes, let me just
awesome.
confirm that's there, and then I'll
Okay.
give Instagram my full attention. Yep, here we
All
are.
right.
Okay, good. So I will jump back over here. Thank
Okay.
y'all for your flexibility.
Thanks for joining us here. All right. Well, hey, Tasha.
Yeah, hey Tasha.
Thanks for coming. All right, Melanie, you want to start?
Yeah, sure. So thank y'all, everybody. Here we are, and really just have enjoyed National Poetry Month and wanted to have an opportunity to, for Presenta and I to kind of introduce ourselves a little bit, just share some of our love and interest of poetry, and also introduce a poet we've both come to really admire from the Harlem Renaissance, Georgia Douglas Johnson. So Presenta, tell me a little about why is it poetry? Like, why poetry? Why do you love poetry? What first got you interested? Why does poetry matter?
Oh, yeah, great question. I love poetry. So I think it started for me when I was in first grade. I wrote my first poem. And since then, I've just had a love for poetry. You know, poetry for me, it says things in a unique way that really grabs us inside, with the use of metaphor and imagery. Artists and musicians, people in the arts and poetry and language, I think they can say things in such a unique way that can't happen in other
Mm,
ways. So I call poetry one of my great loves.
mm,
And, Robert Frost says poetry has a way of catching us by the throat.
mm.
So I feel that with poetry.
Yeah, that's good. And I totally relate, especially the idea of the poem saying things that prose can't. And actually, it was some times in crisis, especially the past several years, just really maybe questions around calling or just some of my prayer. Like for me, and a big part of my interest now is how to relate poetry and prayer. And so even
Mhm.
several years ago in a time of crisis and really trying to reach out to God, asking that big why question that we all have to ask at some point or another. And I found that prose just didn't cut it. And so I was drawn to the Psalms, the poetry of the Bible, but also in my own prayers, the prose wasn't getting what I was trying to say. And I found that only poetry could really make room for that mystery, for that ability to just walk around and kind of the mystery of a word and the metaphor, being able to connect on like ideas. So yeah, poetry in some ways is really spoken a lot to even just my sanity and my relationship with God. So and especially the past
Oh,
few
yeah.
years and even this past year with the pandemic, I've found that I've really needed to, several times this past year, I read the headlines or I get on even social media and certain prose pieces are very frustrating to me. But poetry, somehow the
Mm-hmm.
reading and writing of it helps me to feel grounded and connected to God in
Mm-hmm.
a way that prose does not. So,
That's so good. And poetry is
yes,
having
Sarah.
a moment now, like with Amanda Gorman.
Yes,
It's
absolutely.
so wonderful that now poetry has always been there, but now I think more people are aware and thinking about poetry and reading poetry. So, which I think is a wonderful thing. So, really exciting.
Yeah, I know. I love the inauguration. I was just, I didn't know what to expect, but the power behind Amanda Gorman's been amazing. And well, several people have commented, and as we'll get into shortly, the original Harlem Renaissance from 100 years ago, but several have commented that we're living in that moment now, that we're having kind of a renewed Harlem Renaissance, especially with the Black art scene. And
Yes.
want to kind of learn from the Black art scene, especially the original Harlem Renaissance today, and just what we can learn and how we can respond. But that's a good point, Presenta, especially about the energy around Amanda Gorman's work and other poets like her. So,
Hmm.
so
Yeah. Yeah, that's right. The mentioning the Harlem Renaissance poets, I think that's a good segue into today. Today's
yeah,
poem is from one of the Harlem Renaissance
absolutely.
poets. Um, so yeah, you want to start?
Yeah, sure. So, Yeah, so we're going to be reading two poems this today and next week by a Harlem Renaissance poet named Georgia Douglas Johnson. So I don't know, Presenta, if you want to briefly explain what the Harlem Renaissance might not be familiar. You can jump into Georgia's poems.
Yeah. So the Harlem So it actually kind of started with what's called the Great Migration of the 20th century, which is when hundreds of thousands of Black people just moved out of the South and they moved into urban areas. And so the Harlem Renaissance poets were, this group of writers and artists and thinkers, intellectuals who were really active in the creative scene in Harlem. And so they were, in theaters, nightclubs. They were writers, thinkers, poets, and these are the people that we call the Harlem Renaissance poets. And I'm going to read a few names of some of these you might recall or you might recognize.
Yeah.
Langston Hughes, Claude McKay, James Weldon Johnson, Anne Spencer, Margaret Walker, Jean Toomer, Sterling A. Brown, W.B. Du Bois. And these are just the name of a few of the names of the Harlem Renaissance poets. And of course, Georgia Douglas Johnson, who we're reading today.
Yeah, absolutely. And one notable thing, especially with Langston Hughes, and we'll actually get into that for all that the Harlem Renaissance kind of had his epicenter in Harlem, New York, it also spread here to DC. So, for example, Langston Hughes was known as he was a busboy at a restaurant, and he left some poems. He knew there was a prominent literary critic. Yeah, it's Langston Hughes. That's right,
Oh,
Tasha.
yeah.
So the
Yeah.
story is, and I'm sure I'm botching the details, but it'll get it to an interesting point. Anyway, he was at a restaurant here in DC, and he knew there was a prominent literary critic eating at the restaurant where he was a busboy, so he left some poems of his on the table, just kind of slid them next to him and just wanted him to get an audience with him. And so that literary critic then in the paper the next day said, "Oh, I had an encounter with a busboy poet yesterday." And so that idea of Langston Hughes being a busboy poet, there's now a prominent chain restaurant here in DC called Busboys and Poets, and one actually here in my neighborhood. So it's a very prominent place for poetry slams, open mic nights, prominent thinkers to come together, and a big part of the literary scene even here in DC.
That's so cool. What a great
Yes.
story.
Yeah.
And
So,
you mentioned
um,
County Cullen. Yeah, he's another one. Another one. Yes.
yes. So,
Yeah. Cool
but
story.
but today we're going to pivot a little more to the women of the Harlem Renaissance, and
Yeah.
specifically one woman that both Presenta and I have really enjoyed reading her poems, Georgia Douglas Johnson. And so happy to just offer a little bit of feedback. I didn't even know who she was until a month ago, but I've enjoyed the exercise the past month of trying to educate myself and learn about these poets and promote their work in the voice. So Georgia Douglas Johnson, a little bit about her. She was born in 1880 in Atlanta, where I'm from, so I felt a immediate kinship there. And then she went to school in Cleveland, was actually a musician, quite a polymath, actually. She was an activist, a playwright, and a poet, and a musician.
Mm.
So Presenta, I don't know about you if you have any other interests or if you bring any other different spheres into your poetry work, but I admire Georgia's, just the fact she's really good at all these things. For me, it's really the poetry,
Yeah,
but
that's so exciting. Like that she was this polymath, which
yeah,
is so cool to know that about her.
yeah,
I love that. I love that. And she was into all those different things. But I can't wait to dig in to talk
yeah,
more about that.
yes, absolutely. So, but anyway, just to say that she's known in a lot of different fields, but today we'll focus on the poetry. So anyway, she moved up to DC with her husband and two sons. For her husband, a job in politics for her husband here in DC, but he died shortly after that, and she was left with two sons, was widowed, had to go from one clerical job to another. A lot of challenges just trying to really support her family. But even in that, after her husband died, and she too, Georgia Douglas Johnson, was a woman from Native American, African American, and English background. So and we'll talk about that in today's poem. But she also, one other prominent thing about her that I love is she formed these literary salons at her house. They were called the Estranged salons. And for 40 years on Saturday nights, she would invite some of the luminaries that you named earlier and invite them into her home to talk about the politics of the day, especially anti-lynching campaigns, and
Mm.
discuss poetry and the arts, and just have a chance, a safe space to really just kind of process what was going on and how they were responding artistically. So I don't know, Presenta, if you've ever been to a salon like that, but
I was just thinking as you're talking, I would love that. Like, where can we get all our friends together and move
yes,
there and do that? Because that
yeah,
sounds amazing to me.
yeah,
And I hear stories like that about people who had other thinkers and writers, and they'd all get together and they'd share ideas. And I think, wow, I wish we could do that. And we probably could if we
yeah,
search our communities.
absolutely. And she also would just, if people were passing through town, would just take them in. And so she was kind of known for her hospitality, and even whether people lived there or just for visiting. So, but anyway, with that in mind, we want to jump into one of George's poems. So this polymath woman with this really amazing heart for hospitality of diverse background. So in a second, I'm going to read her poem today. It's called Cosmopolite. Actually a new word I'd never heard until we found her poem, but let me pull it up and I will read it, and then hopefully we can see if we can put it in the comments section. But I invite you just at first to just hear it and listen to it and just kind of experience the poem through the ear. So this is Cosmopolite by Georgia Douglas Johnson. Not wholly this or that, but wrought of alien bloods am I, a product of the interplay of traveled hearts. Estranged yet not estranged, I stand, all comprehending. From my estate I view earth's frail dilemma. Scion of fused strength am I, all understanding. Nor this, nor that contains me. And that was Cosmopolite by Georgia Douglas Johnson.
Yeah,
Wow.
that's a beautiful poem.
Yeah.
I don't think I
Absolutely.
can get that in the comments. I'm not sure because we hopped on at the last minute.
Okay.
Not
Yeah,
how to
no problem. So yeah, viewers, if you're able to just Google Cosmopolite by Georgia Douglas Johnson, then I invite you to, I wonder if maybe I can type it out, at least the title of it.
Yeah. Yeah, at least you can, maybe put the title in there. So
Yeah.
Cosmopolite.
So,
It's kind of like
yes,
Cosmopolitan. Yeah, there you go. Cosmopolite.
exactly.
Yeah.
By Georgia Douglas Johnson. So if you would like to pull up the poem, you're welcome to. Otherwise, feel free to. Yes, exactly, Tasha. So yeah,
Yeah.
I'm wondering any thoughts we have about this poem. It's a short poem, but it packs a big punch. There's a lot to it.
Mm. Yeah, I like Tasha mentioned, nor this nor that. No, nor wholly this or that. I really resonated with that. I think for those of us who struggle with like ethnic identity or racial identity, I got that. Like, I think did you mention that she was a mixed race, Melanie, or had a mixed background?
Yes,
Yes. So,
that's right.
yeah,
That's
and so
right.
me as a woman who was born in India but raised in the U.S., I feel that tension, like not wholly this or that. Like, what am I? I'm kind of somewhere in the middle, and what defines me? Yes, Sarah, I think a lot of us can identify with that in between space. Whether it's our racial identity or whether it's maybe an illness or something else that makes us in the middle.
Yeah.
I just love that she started her poem that way, and a very powerful way to start.
Yeah, absolutely. In a very, very small way, after my 5 years in China, especially living in China, but then looking back at the US. But of course, I felt the outsider role while in China, but increasingly, even living there, when I would talk with people back in the US, I started to feel increasingly a distance there too. And so that nor this nor
Mm-hmm.
that, just even in a small way, living into that, that gave me more compassion for those who maybe have that for a lifetime or don't choose that situation. I know I had chosen to move to another country, but just to have that compassion and that inner subjective experience of knowing what it might mean in a variety of ways to be nor this nor that. So another thing I really loved is, she starts out not wholly this or that, but then she talks about alien bloods. And when I hear that word alien, I don't know about you, but it has there's a little bit of fear around that, or it's a word that can have a little fear or anxiety. So she names and says, I'm of alien bloods. I have alien bloods in me. But then by the end, we get to this verse of Scion of fused strength. And so I love it. It kind of starts with, she's maybe naming even what maybe others have called her or said about her, maybe even derogatory.
Yeah.
We don't know, we can imagine. But the poem starts with using words that have maybe some fear, anxiety attached to them. But by the end, we get to this image of fused strength. And she really sees that as her power. She really sees how she's got this distinct perspective. She can look out because she feels like she's not this or that, a bit of an outsider perspective. She can see things uniquely that others can't. So
Mm, yeah.
um,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, and she also says like estranged yet not estranged. She's
Mm,
going back to that theme of just feeling this in between space of, where do I belong? I'm estranged, but yet not estranged. Like
mm,
I'm here, I belong here, but yet I don't belong here.
yes.
And so that's so interesting. And then at the end of the poem, she starts off saying, not wholly this or that, but then she says, nor this nor that contains me. And I think, wow, she's come from this place of I'm neither this or that. I feel estranged, yet I'm not estranged. But she says, nor this nor that contains me. And I think, wow, I think she's come to this place of understanding of who she is. Like she's not going to let that stop her.
Mm,
She's not going to let that estrangement stop her.
yeah.
That lack of belonging or that confusion of being with from alien bloods, like that fear. Uh,
Yes.
she's come to this place of strength, like
Yeah.
says fused strength. So I just think it's so interesting to see in just these 10 or 12 lines,
Yeah. Very
uh,
short poem.
almost like a biography of her life in some way,
Yes.
where she's moved from who she was to where she is now.
Absolutely. And that speaks to knowing the fact that she comes from African American, Native American, and English ancestry. But as we talked about, she started these salons. And so maybe others who felt nor this nor that. She actually created a new community around herself. So I just love that she took what others might call a liability, as you said, really made it a strength and even formed maybe a new community where she did belong and can be her true self and her full
Mm.
self in that space. So,
Yeah.
yeah. So I guess one other thought I have is even if you're able to pull up the poem and look at the line breaks, which for those of us who write poetry, we know that line breaks are a very subjective thing. It's really kind of how a poet decides to break a line is definitely very a personal and subjective thing, but it says a lot about the poet's intent. And so interestingly, it's a short poem with a lot of choppy fragments. And so if you look at each line by itself, one line is just the words, but wrought. Another line is just the words from my estate. So these are very, very just short, choppy lines. And so by themselves, if you look at them, it's hard to tell what's going on. But only when you read the poem in its entirety and maybe step back to see the whole poem do you get the full picture. And I think that even the form she chose and how to break the lines kind of strengthens the message of the poem, of having that outsider's perspective of being able to see things more
Mm.
fully. So,
Yeah, that's beautiful. You know what? Interesting. Yeah, we've talked about, is there any rhyme or reason to line breaks? Because
yes.
it's like one of those things where, oh, where do you put the line break? But yeah, it's so interesting to see what she's done. And one interesting thing about this poem is that her other poems that we've read were all rhyming.
Yes.
This particular one did not rhyme, which is
Yeah.
so interesting. And I wonder, kind of like reflective of her and her personality. Like I'm neither this nor that. I'm not contained by this rhyme. I'm
Mm.
contained by
Yes.
a specific number of syllables. So it's
Yes.
almost like this poem reflects who she is and this freedom that she's found in her identity. Um,
Yeah, absolutely. And I totally think that was very intentional on her part. And next week we will read a rhyming poem just
yes,
so we can get a broader perspective of her work. So
yeah,
sometimes a poem's form makes that choice for you, like how many syllables the line can be or how long it can be. But in this case, we know she obviously was very intentional in how because it's a free verse poem. So,
hmm
but yeah, I love your point that she's not even bound by the form here. She's creating her own form
yeah.
because she's her own person. So very good. Well, um, let's pivot a little now to some more modern day poems, including a brand new poem that Prasanta's written. But before we get to that, I want to introduce the concept of a writing prompt. I'm guessing a lot of y'all are familiar at least with the idea of a writing prompt, but yeah, just gently or generally just this idea of being given a list of questions or a challenge, an invitation to try and write a piece, whether it's poems or other genres, but to kind of excavate maybe a path in our mind or imagination we wouldn't go to otherwise. So really to open up fresh ideas, maybe we get stuck in a rut and find ourselves writing about the same topics, but a prompt can really help to shake us out of that a little bit and point us in a new direction. Presenta, I don't know if you have any thoughts about this prompt in particular, in general, why you really appreciate writing prompts and find value
I
in
think
them.
writers love prompts. Writers and poets love prompts because when you get a prompt, it does force you to think about something in a new way, or it gives you something new to think about. And so I think that it's even broad more than just for writers. Whatever you're doing, if you get a writing prompt and you can journal about it or write about it, you don't have to be a writer to enjoy a writing prompt or a poem prompt, because I think it can help you to think about your circumstances in a new way as you journal about it. And I think what's also interesting is about, Melanie wrote this prompt for me and I wrote a prompt for her.
Yes.
So when she gave me this prompt, it made me think, like, okay, it really puts you on this journey of, there's so many veins I can take, and I can think about my life. And so there's kind of a self-discovery journey that's associated with a writing prompt. So I think they're great. And I think they can really
Yeah.
get out of your ruts in your writing. If you feel like you're stuck somewhere, try a prompt.
Yeah. Absolutely. So with that in mind, and thank you, yeah, as Presenta said, we actually, based on Georgia Douglas Johnson's poems, so each of us picked one of her poems and then wrote a prompt based on that poem and gave to the other one over the past several weeks. And so I'm the one, I picked Cosmopolite and wrote a prompt, and then Presenta has written a poem in response to it. And so this is the first time it's been read publicly, but I invite you now, Presenta, if you have your poem that you've written, if you'd like to read it out loud.
Oh, sure. Yeah. Welcome to the world premiere of this poem. Okay. So this poem is called,
Yay! Woo!
Woohoo, yay. This is called A Twisted Vine, after Georgia Douglas Johnson. Not one or the other, a foot in two continents. An island in the ocean am I. Honeyed ginger, a breaking seed planted by a bird, slicing through broken clouds. A dream becoming am I. Twisted honeysuckle vines around a sandalwood tree.
Mm,
And that's my poem.
thank you. That's beautiful. I love, yes. Thank you. Woo, yay! Clap, clap, clap. Snap, snap, snap. So, but yeah, I love that just in a few short lines, there's so much powerful imagery. I love the honeysuckle and the honey ginger. Today, I'm just struck by the sweetness of that. Even as there's imagery of a seed being broken, of a bird carrying a seed. So if I remember, yeah, a broken seed. So there's a broken seed there's some pain. There's something that maybe has been lost, or some grief, and yet there's also the promise of new life. We get to the end of the sandalwood tree and the honeysuckle vine wrapped around it, which is such a beautiful and unique image. I've never seen a sandalwood tree with honeysuckle vine around it, but I love that. I love what that's doing in my imagination, just
Yeah.
to even consider it. So, but I love too the imagery of, yeah, the seed planted by a bird. That we have both a seed and we have this tree and this vine, something very grounded and rooted, and the strength of that. But then also a bird, and this imagery of kind of flying and being above it all, and having to be able to see from a broader outside perspective. And so kind of even a few short verses, the tension there of these different images. So, and that honey ginger, oh, I just want to eat some honey ginger.
That reminds me
Delicious.
because I love chai, so it's like,
Mm,
but there's so many different meanings, and it's not just about that. But yeah, when I grew up
absolutely.
in Alabama, and so the honeysuckle vines, I grew up with just those growing wild, and you could actually go and sip the nectar straight out of the honeysuckle vine, and that's just one of my just dearest and fondest memories of growing up in the South, was these
Mm,
fragrant, sweet honeysuckle vines that would grow wild, and I miss that. I miss being near that. But then sandalwood is a very fragrant tree that grows in India.
mm,
And the sandalwood
mm,
tree, because of snakes, they're attracted to the smell. And so the
mm,
sandalwood trees have snakes around them, and it's really difficult to get the
mm,
sandalwood oil, which is very expensive and something that it's a prized scent that
mm,
people want. So extracting the oil and getting the scent and making the sandalwood soap and the sandalwood perfume you know, it's not an easy task because the snakes will come and, you know, hang around the tree.
Yeah.
So,
Absolutely. And I didn't know that about I've heard of sandalwood. I didn't know about the snakes. And I love that you took the imagery then of a honeysuckle vine instead, something else that wraps around. And just something very beautiful. And to think of the smell of a honeysuckle and sandalwood together is, it's, you know, to even imagine it just is really good for the imagination. So,
mm,
but thank you. So yeah, Sarah, that's right. I didn't either. Learning all
yeah,
sorts of, that's the fun about poems is it expand your imagination and you never know what you'll learn either. But I come away with a sense of wonder and gratitude all the time.
yeah,
So
with me.
absolutely. Well, let's see. I guess our next question is now what? What happens next? So we've learned a little about the Harlem Renaissance. We've learned about Georgia Douglas Johnson, and also have written poems, and including Presenta's poem today. So I guess to invite any watchers now or in the future that if you would like to get the writing prompt that I wrote or present this poem, you're welcome to sign up for our newsletters. So Presenta, any thoughts about that, or I
Yeah,
guess how we can connect readers?
Melanie's prompt will be in her newsletter, and the poem that she's going to read next week. I wrote a prompt for her. We're going to read a poem next week, that another Georgia Douglas poem, and I wrote a prompt, and then Melanie wrote a poem from that prompt. So
Yes.
on her newsletter, you can get her prompt and her poem. On my newsletter, you can get my prompt and my poem.
Yes.
Yeah. Anyway, just if anybody has any questions or comments, feel free to type them in. But otherwise, we're going to be back here again live next Friday, same time.
Yes.
Maybe we'll just hop on Instagram again because,
Yeah.
yeah, I think this is great. It seemed to work really well. So,
Yeah. Well, thank you,
yeah,
Tasha. Thank you all
thanks
for joining us.
for
And
joining, Tasha.
yeah, we'll put the newsletter sign-ups maybe on our Facebook. At least it's easier to comment there. The toggling, not this nor that, not Facebook nor Instagram, right? A little
Yeah,
bit of, anyway,
yeah.
alternating
Where are
between
we going to put it?
platforms. I'll put it on Facebook because it's
Yeah,
easier
we'll
to
put it.
type comments there. But anyway, thank you all so much for joining. And yeah, we'll be back next week for another round of
Yeah,
poems.
yeah, sounds great. Thank you all.
Thank
Have
you.
a good day.
Bye-bye.
Bye.